All right, welcome everyone to Meteorology Matters. If you're really interested in understanding what makes our world tick, the forces
Hmm.
that shape it, then you are definitely in the right place.
Yeah, for sure.
Today we're going to be we're going to be focusing on the fascinating world of meteorology.
Okay,
We're going to be looking at hurricanes, recent activity, and kind of the patterns we're seeing.
it's good.
And importantly, the impact that these hurricanes have, on our wallets, on our communities.
Absolutely.
So you shared some really interesting stuff with us, some cool information.
Yeah.
And today we're going to try to unpack all of this. We're going to look at, how hurricane activity is tied to things like insurance and also the crucial role that agencies like the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration play in all of this.
Yeah.
We really want to give you a clear picture of what's happening and why it matters so much.
Okay, great.
And hey, if you want to dive even deeper and stay up to date, you can follow meteorologist Rob Jones. He's on Instagram, meteorologist, on TikTok, TV meteorologist. And if you're on YouTube, follow Rob Jones Hurricane.
Or-
That's where you'll find Meteorology Matters podcast playlist.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. Let's talk about the money.
Good.
Let's talk about the financial toll of some of these recent hurricanes. It seems like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they've announced they need to borrow a pretty substantial amount of money,
Hmm.
something like $2 billion from the U.S. Treasury. And this isn't just for, day-to-day operations. This is specifically to cover claims from people who are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP.
Right.
This really just underscores the immediate financial impact that these storms can bring.
Oh, yeah.
It makes you wonder about how sustainable this whole system is.
Well, the numbers are really something. I mean, we're looking at potentially over $10 billion in flood insurance claims just from Hurricanes Helene and Milton back in 2024, and that's not even counting all the other flooding events that happened that year. So it's putting a huge strain on the NTIP's resources. They just weren't designed to handle this many big catastrophic events, one right after the other, without needing to tap into some extra funds. I think it raises some serious questions about, whether the premiums people are paying are actually enough to cover the ever-increasing costs of all this flood damage, especially with, the possibility of climate change leading to even more intense storms in the future. And for the average person out there, this could mean, their insurance premiums are going to go up. Maybe they're going to see some changes in what their insurance policies actually cover. Something to definitely keep an eye on.
Right. So it sounds like, this NFIP, it just isn't really built to handle this kind of like onslaught of huge disasters all in one year without needing that backup, that financial backup.
Yeah.
And it seems like, just the scale of the financial impact from 2024, those storms pretty much exhausted, the money that they had been collecting through these premiums to actually pay out on those claims.
Mhm.
It seems like a system under a lot of stress, a lot of strain.
For sure.
And it's fascinating to actually look at the specific numbers, the figures for each of these storms, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a closer look for Helene, by early February this year, they had already processed over 57,400 flood claims. That's a lot.
Hmm.
And paid out more than $4.5 billion.
Wow.
And the estimates for the total losses from Helene, they range from $6.4 billion to $7.4 billion.
Yeah.
And then you got Milton, different kind of damage, but still over 21,100 claims.
Wow.
Over $740 million paid out by, early February. And the total estimated losses for Milton, somewhere between $1.2 billion and $2.9 billion. It's quite a contrast.
It is. It's really interesting to see the impact of each storm sort of individually.
Yeah.
And, Helene, it brought a ton of rain, just, flooded the Southeast, especially after making landfall in Florida as a huge, powerful Category 4 storm in late September 2024.
Right.
But Milton, which hit Florida just a bit later in early October, that's actually considered the costliest hurricane of that 2024 season for private insurers, and it might even be one of the costliest ever.
Wow.
So it sounds like Milton, its punch was more in the wind damage.
Right.
And that distinction between, wind damage and water damage, it really shapes how these insurance companies deal with the aftermath.
It does. And it really highlights, the crucial difference in the way that insurance liabilities work and also the overall economic impact on people and on communities,
Right.
So the fact that FEMA's debt has now climbed to around $22.5 billion with the ability to borrow up to $30.4 billion, that just shows you the scale of these events and how much we rely on the federal government to help out with flood insurance. And it's interesting that, even after all that borrowing, the NFIP still had over $600 million available at the end of January to keep paying out claims.
Right.
So, they're definitely working hard to manage all these huge financial demands. And, they have actually made some progress in paying back some of that debt. They've made about $2.8 billion in principal repayments since 2005, and that's not even counting the interest payments, which are, covered by the premiums that policyholders pay.
So that gives us a little bit of a glimpse into the long-term, financial picture, the stability of this program.
Yeah.
So let's move on. Let's talk about something that directly affects homeowners.
Okay.
Potential changes to insurance liability.
Mm-hmm.
And this is specifically in Florida.
Okay.
And it has to do with who is responsible when a neighbor's tree falls and damages your property.
I see.
This seems like something that would happen pretty often.
It does.
And could be pretty contentious, pretty controversial for homeowners.
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time. And right now, the law in Florida, it says that the responsibility for that damage caused by the falling tree, it lies with the homeowner where the tree lands.
Right.
So that means they're the ones who have to deal with the insurance claims and pay the deductibles.
Wow.
But there's this new proposal. They're calling it the Fallen Tree Act.
Okay.
And it's aiming to change this rule. And, a shift like this could have a big impact on how neighbors interact with each other.
Yeah.
And how insurance claims get handled.
Yeah. So what would this new act actually do? Right. It sounds like it would basically flip the responsibility.
It would. The goal of the Fallen Tree Act is to shift that responsibility back to the owner of the property where the tree actually came from.
Mm-hmm.
So, it could give some relief to those homeowners who are stuck paying for the damage from a neighbor's tree. But there's a bit of a gray area in the bill that people need to be aware of.
Okay, so what's the unclear part? What's the catch, especially in, a hurricane-prone state like Florida?
Well, the bill as it stands, it doesn't say who would be responsible for the damage if the tree falls during a big storm, like a hurricane.
Right.
Something that they often legally classify as an act of God or an act of nature.
Right.
So, given that Florida gets hit by these severe weather events all the time, hurricanes, high winds, this lack of clarity it's a bit of a problem. It could cause some real issues. You get a hurricane, those winds are so strong. How could you possibly prove that the tree owner was somehow negligent?
Yeah.
Right. It just highlights a potential loophole, or at least, an area of confusion if this bill were to become law.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, during a huge hurricane, it would be pretty much impossible to say, well, the homeowner should have known that their tree was going to fall.
Exactly.
It just highlights that, this could be problematic for homeowners.
Right. And the arborists who have looked at this legislation, they've pointed out that, under the current laws, the insurance companies, they usually handle these kinds of things between themselves.
Right.
Especially when it's obvious that the tree fell because of a big storm. So, they work out the claims, they figure out who's liable without necessarily having the neighbors sue each other.
Right.
So the current system, maybe it's not perfect for the homeowner whose property gets damaged.
Right.
But it at least gives the insurance companies a way to manage these situations.
Right.
And this new act could really disrupt that.
Right.
And maybe even lead to more arguments between neighbors.
Yeah. So it sounds like the current system, while maybe not ideal for the person whose house, takes the hit, at least provides a path, a process for the insurance companies to sort things out.
Right.
And this new act could really shake things up.
It could.
So with all of this, with this potential shift in liability and this uncertainty around what happens in major storms, what are the experts telling homeowners in Florida?
Well, the main thing they're saying is, read your insurance policy. Really take a look at it and understand what you might have to pay for if your property gets damaged.
Right.
And that includes damage from fallen trees, no matter where the tree came from. They're also suggesting that homeowners think about setting up a kind of like an emergency fund specifically for home repairs, separate from their regular emergency savings, so that they've got some money set aside to cover things like insurance deductibles or repairs that their insurance might not completely cover.
Right.
So being prepared, understanding your coverage, having a little bit of money set aside, that can really give you some peace of mind.
That's That's really good practical advice,
Yeah.
especially if you live in a place that gets a lot of severe weather, like hurricanes.
Right.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration, or NOAA, as it's often known,
Right.
and the National Weather Service. It sounds like the work that they do is really valuable.
Oh, it is. The general consensus is that NOAA and the National Weather Service, they provide a huge benefit to taxpayers, real return on that investment.
Yeah.
And, to put it in perspective, it costs about $7 per person per year to run the National Weather Service. But the benefits, things like being prepared for bad weather, making transportation safer, helping industries like agriculture and construction be more efficient, and preventing and mitigating disasters, those benefits, they're estimated to be worth, 10 to 100 times that initial investment.
Wow.
So it's like this incredible multiplier effect.
Yeah, that's an amazing return. It really shows you the power of having a good weather forecasting system in place.
Right.
It's so much more than just, knowing whether to bring an umbrella. It really affects our entire economy. And it seems like NOAA has been really working to connect those weather and ocean observations, the forecasts, with emergency preparedness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Studies have actually shown that the partnership with the National Weather Service has really changed the way the emergency management community works. Instead of just reacting to disasters after they happen, they can now be much more proactive and prepared for these extreme events.
Right.
And this ability to sort of anticipate what the weather's going to do, that brings huge benefits to society.
Yeah.
Benefits that we couldn't even dream of a few decades ago. I mean, think about being able to plan evacuations days before a hurricane hits. That saves lives.
Right.
It reduces damage.
It's amazing how accurate our weather forecasts are these days.
Right.
And it's easy to take that for granted, but it's clear that decades of investment in research and technology have really paid off.
They have.
So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those investments, those crucial investments that have made such a difference in how well we can predict the weather?
Yeah. So over the past few decades, taxpayer funding has been really, really important in helping us develop better computer models for weather forecasting.
Right.
Also, getting data from all these different sources, weather balloons, satellites, buoys in the ocean, aircraft, ground-based sensors, and also just basic research to better understand how the atmosphere works.
Okay.
All of these things, they've had a huge impact on our ability to protect people and property. The daily forecasts, the watches, the warnings that we see on TV, on the internet, on our phones, those are all a result of the hard work of scientists and technicians at NOAA and the National Weather Service.
Right.
And some people even estimate that, the tax revenue generated by private companies that use NOAA's data and services actually covers the entire cost of running the National Weather Service.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come. You mentioned that people who remember weather forecasts from, say, the 1970s or 80s, they can really appreciate how much better they are now.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of historical context, just how much has forecasting changed, over the years, over the decades?
Well, compared to what we have today, weather forecasts back in the late 20th century, they were a lot less accurate.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't give you as much warning, and they just weren't as detailed. And then if you go back even further to the early 1900s, I mean, hurricanes would often hit the coast with almost no warning at all.
Wow.
If you look at old newspapers from back then,
Mm-hmm.
from big hurricane events, sometimes there's no mention of the storm that's about to, devastate the area in just a few hours.
Wow.
That's unthinkable today, thanks to all the scientific advancements we've made.
That really puts things into perspective. The fact that we can now have, sometimes days of warning before a hurricane makes landfall, it's really amazing.
It is.
And it's not just hurricanes. It seems like our ability to forecast other severe weather, tornadoes, for example, that's also gotten a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. Tornado warning times
Mm.
have also improved significantly over the past few decades. And it's remarkable because even though we have more people living in tornado-prone areas now than ever before, the number of deaths and injuries from tornadoes hasn't increased at the same rate.
Right.
So that suggests that the investments in NOAA and the National Weather Service they're saving lives
Yeah.
and reducing the impact of these terrible events. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people are alive today because of these improvements in forecasting and the preparedness that those forecasts allow.
That's an incredible accomplishment, and as we've seen, that ability to predict the weather accurately, it has such a positive impact on our society.
Yeah, it does.
But, some of the information you shared, it raises some concerns about the future of NOAA, especially regarding some recent and potential staff cuts.
Yeah, that's a real worry. There have been some staff reductions at NOAA recently, and that included, initially letting go of some of the Hurricane Hunter flight crew, although some of them have been rehired.
Okay.
But these actions have, they've caused a lot of concern, both among meteorologists and in the emergency management community, especially as we head into another hurricane season.
Right.
And there are also reports that, there could be even more significant staff cuts at NOAA in the future.
Right.
And that could really affect the agency's ability to do its job effectively.
The fact that those hurricane hunters were initially let go is concerning.
Yeah, it is.
So can you explain to our listeners why these hurricane hunter flights and the data they collect are so important?
What do they do that other systems can't? Well, the Hurricane Hunter flights, they're run by NOAA's fleet of special aircraft, and they're really crucial for gathering information about what's happening inside and around these tropical cyclones, these hurricanes.
Right.
And they do this in real time. These brave flight crews, they fly right into the eye of the storm.
Wow.
And they collect really important data about the hurricane's internal pressure, the wind speeds at different altitudes, the temperature, and the overall structure of the storm. And then this information is sent straight to the National Hurricane Center. And it gets fed into those complex computer models that meteorologists use to predict where the hurricane is going to go, what we call its track, and how strong it's going to get, which is its intensity.
Right.
And without this inside view of the storm, those models would have to rely on satellite images and other remote sensing data, which are, they're useful, but they're not as precise. They might miss some crucial details about what's actually going on inside the hurricane itself. So these Hurricane Hunter flights, they basically provide that ground truth, that helps make our predictions a lot more accurate.
And what would happen if we didn't have enough data from these Hurricane Hunter flights? It sounds like it would make all of our forecasts less reliable.
It would. If we don't have that critical data, or if we don't get it in time, it means those hurricane track and intensity forecasts, they're going to be less accurate.
Right.
And that could delay warnings for emergency managers and for people living in the path of the storm. And that could have a knock-on effect on those really important decisions about when and where to issue evacuations, how to prepare for the storm. And on top of that, there's also the worry that if NOAA's research labs get hit with budget cuts, that could slow down improvements in hurricane modeling. And those improvements they're essential for making our forecasts even better in the future. The whole emergency management community relies on that timely and accurate information from those Hurricane Hunter flights, to adjust their forecasts, to fine-tune evacuation plans, to really figure out where the storm is most likely to make landfall. So any disruption to that data flow could have serious consequences.
It really highlights how all of these different things are connected,
They are.
A cut in staffing at an agency like NOAA, it can really have an impact on the accuracy of our forecasts and, ultimately on public safety.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about something called accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE.
Okay.
This is a way of measuring how much activity there is during a hurricane season.
Right. The ACE index was developed to give us a better way to track the overall power of all the named storms throughout a whole hurricane season. So it doesn't just count how many storms there are. It takes into account how long each storm lasts and how strong its winds are over its entire lifetime. So basically, a hurricane that hangs around for a long time and has really strong winds, that's going to contribute a lot more to the season's ACE value than a short-lived, weaker tropical storm.
So it's not just, counting how many storms pop up.
Yeah.
It really looks at how intense they are, how long they last.
Right.
So what would you consider, an average ACE value for a typical hurricane season?
Well, the average ACE value for an Atlantic hurricane season is about 122.5, but of course it can vary a lot from year to year. Like in 2005, which was a really active year with some incredibly strong storms, the ACE value was over 245.
Wow.
That's more than double the average.
Wow.
And to give you an example of how much one really strong storm can affect the ACE, Hurricane Ivan back in 2004, that holds the record for the most ACE points ever accumulated by a single cyclone in the Atlantic. So you can see how one really powerful, long-lasting hurricane can really skew the seasonal total.
It's interesting how just one really strong storm can change the overall ACE for the whole season.
Right.
But you mentioned that the ACE doesn't account for all the potential impacts of a hurricane, like flooding.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So while ACE is great for measuring a storm's intensity and duration, based on its wind speeds, it doesn't measure other things like how much rain the storm produces and the flooding that comes with that, or whether it spawns tornadoes. And Hurricane Helene in 2024, that's a perfect example. It had a pretty low ACE value compared to some other major hurricanes, but it caused a lot of flooding, widespread flooding, which made it one of the costliest U.S. hurricanes on record. So, even if a hurricane season has a lower ACE, it doesn't mean there won't be individual storms that are really destructive because of those other factors that ACE doesn't measure.
That's really important for people to remember, just because a hurricane season has a lower ACE doesn't mean it's going to be less impactful, if you happen to be in the path of one of those really damaging storms.
Exactly.
So how do experts view the ACE index?
Right.
As a way of measuring hurricane season activity, what are its strengths and weaknesses?
Well, most experts think that ACE is a more accurate and useful way to measure hurricane season activity than just counting how many named storms there are.
Okay.
And this is especially true now because we're better at detecting and monitoring tropical cyclones with, all the satellite technology, the improved forecast models, all those observation tools. So because of that, we're naming more storms each year, including some that are pretty weak and don't last very long. But just because there are more named storms, it doesn't mean the season is more intense or more impactful. The ACE index helps us see the bigger picture by looking at the strength and duration of those storms. So, for example, in 2023, the Atlantic hurricane season had 20 named storms, which is a lot. But the overall ACE was actually close to the average.
Okay.
So that tells us that many of those storms were pretty weak and short-lived. And in fact, that season was generally considered to be less impactful than some others with fewer but stronger storms.
So ACE really gives us a more complete picture of the total energy of a hurricane season.
It does.
It goes beyond just counting how many storms there are. And, as we look ahead, we're already starting to think about the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, which begins on June 1st. And we actually already have the list of names that will be given to any storms that form.
Right. The World Meteorological Organization, they released the list of names well before the season starts. And they use those names for any tropical storms that reach wind speeds of at least 39 miles per hour. And for 2025, the list starts with Andrea and goes alphabetically through Wendy. And if a storm gets stronger and reaches wind speeds of 74 miles per hour, then it becomes a hurricane. But it keeps the same name it had as a tropical storm. And, there are no names on the list that start with Q, U, X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Mostly because there just aren't that many common names that start with those letters.
It's a familiar process for anyone who follows hurricane season.
Yeah.
And of course, if a hurricane causes a lot of damage or a lot of loss of life, its name can be retired.
Right.
And replaced with a different name in the future so that we don't have to, be reminded of those tragic events.
Exactly.
So with the list of names out there for 2025, can we say anything about how severe or how active the upcoming hurricane season might be?
Honestly, it's still way too early to say for sure. Some forecasting organizations will start to make predictions in the next few months, but the truth is the number and intensity of storms that form, it depends on so many different factors, in the atmosphere and the ocean. And it's just too early to predict those things with any certainty. So we have the names ready, but we'll just have to wait and see what Mother Nature has in store for us.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our meteorological journey for today. We've covered a lot of ground on the Meteorology Matters podcast. We've talked about the financial toll of these hurricanes. We talked about those potential changes to homeowner liability in Florida. The really crucial work of the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration, how we measure hurricane season activity, using that accumulated cyclone energy index.
Yeah.
And we even got a sneak peek at the storm names for the upcoming 2025 season.
it's clear that all of these things are connected, and understanding those connections is really important for all of us.
Absolutely.
As we prepare for and respond to severe weather, the science is always evolving. The systems we have in place are always improving, and staying informed about those changes can really make a difference.
Yeah, we encourage you to keep learning about these topics, to think about how they might affect you, your community. What does a change like the Fallen Tree Act mean for how we interact with our neighbors for insurance claims? How could changes at NOAA, at the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration, affect how quickly and how accurately we get those severe weather warnings? These are all things to think about. And thanks so much for joining us today. And for more information and updates, remember to follow meteorologist Rob Jones. He's on Instagram, meteorologist, on TikTok, TV meteorologist, and on YouTube, you can follow Rob Jones Hurricane. And that's also where you'll find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist.
And one last thought for you to consider. We're seeing more and more extreme weather events these days.
Right.
And they're getting more intense. So how do you think our communities can best use the amazing forecasting technology we have and all the data that NOAA provides to plan for the future and build more resilient infrastructure? And ultimately, how do we create a culture of preparedness at the local level? These are some really important questions for all of us to ponder as we face the challenges of a changing climate.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.